Humans have been using psychedelics for thousands of years, but what role have psychedelics actually played in our evolution as a species? I'm sure we've all heard about the stoned ape hypothesis, but is it actually valid? And if so, how could psychedelics help solve humanity's most pressing global crises in the future? I'm Elena, and this is the integration session where we explore the science, stories, and future of psychedelics. My guest today is Dr. Michael Winkelman, author of the Handbook for Entheogenic Healing and recent article in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies titled Psychedelics and the Future Evolution of Humanity. In this episode, we discuss how psychedelics have shaped who we are as humans and where they could take us next. Let's dive in. Hello, Michael, and welcome to the Integration Session podcast. Thank you so much for being here today. It's great to have you. Could you please start by just introducing yourself and telling our listeners a bit about how you became interested in psychedelic science?
Well, I started off as a physics major as undergraduate and then started taking LSD and psilocybin, and it kind of changed my perspective on things, including trying to understand what these experiences were about. From the beginning, I was, very interested in the scientific side. I'd go over to the medical school library and try to figure out what it was that psychedelics did to our brain. And then I started reading things like Carlos Castaneda, took comparative religion, and learned about shamanism. And it was in that context that I had, what I think is a realization that many have had, but haven't really been able to follow up on, which is, if psychedelics do all these incredible things and they're part of our spiritual experiences and spiritual traditions around the world, they got to have something to do with the origins of religion and shamanism and spirituality. And at that time, I really didn't have a well-grounded basis to understand why, but it was clear from me early on that if we really were to pursue some understanding of the origins of religion and shamanism, that in some substantial way it had to go through the use of psychedelics. So that's kind of like what stimulated my interest. So I, began thinking about this as a, psychology student, shifted to anthropology, started looking at it cross-culturally, but have always been very tied to what I would call a neurophenomenological perspective. That is to say, we need to understand something about the neurological bases of the experiences that we have, and that this really is a key to explaining the significance of these substances in human societies and cultures across time, and perhaps into the future.
Exactly, yeah. So it sounds like you had a bit of a personal experience, and then that led you down the rabbit hole to sort of thinking about the big questions of how psychedelics and humanity sort of intersect,
For sure.
Which is very interesting and why I wanted to pick your brain on the topic.
Okay.
So I would love to dig a little bit more into your background in this space. So how did your work on shamanic practices specifically lead you to explore psychedelics as a potential key factor in our species' past and future evolution?
Well, these two issues, the psychedelics and the shamanism, have been, deeply intertwined from the beginning. But I think that, to me, the most significant part of my, intellectual framework came out of my dissertation. Was eventually published as a book called Shamans, Priests, and Witches. And the core effort of the dissertation was to determine whether or not there were cross-cultural patterns of shamanic practice in the pre-modern world. And so then discovering that, yes, there was a remarkable uniformity in how the ritual is done in hunting, gathering, simple agricultural societies across the pre-modern world, led in my mind to a very simple conclusion. The cross-cultural patterns tell us that this is not arbitrary religious practice. Rather, they tell us that this is something inherent about the way the brain operates. It's something inherent about human nature. So this is where, the whole understanding of psychedelics becomes important, because obviously this is something that stimulates the brain in particular ways, that contributes directly to many of the kinds of experiences that are part of shamanism, such as the spirit world and the out-of-body experiences and, the transfer of energies and inherent healing properties. And so it was really trying to explore, the explanation of a cross-cultural phenomena of the pre-modern world that led me to pay more and more attention to what it was that psychedelics did. And when we look at the practices of the use of psychedelics and pre-modern healing practices, it's pretty clear that they are considered to be central healing tools. So, well before we had the kind of modern clinical studies that show us all the specific ways in which psychedelics affect health, there was already a pretty clear understanding that they could enhance well-being from a simple scientific body of evidence. And then from the cross-cultural point of view, these were key healing tools around the world. And so why did they become so important to healing in cultures around the world? That was sort of my stimuli into exploring these interactions between shamanism and psychedelics.
Yeah, and I loved reading about that in your recent article in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, which was titled Psychedelics and the Future Evolution of Humanity. So, and we'll get into the biological dynamics, which you touched on a little bit, and explaining those a bit more for our listeners, and how this sort of relates to other theories, like the Stoned Ape hypothesis or theory. But first, how far back does human use of psychedelics actually go? And what role did they exactly play in these early adaptations that you're mentioning?
Well, we may know with greater certitude sometime in the future when we can make more specific genetic studies that relate both to the brain and the brain functions related to psychedelics and compared to chimps. I mean, the data may be there to really pinpoint this, but probably, 5 million years ago is a good hypothesis when we our ancestors descended from the remaining trees of the savannas of Africa and tried to make their, livelihood on the savannas on the ground. And, from there, we were going to be following the ungulates, as they're called, the precursors of the bovines. And this is where psilocybin grows around the world. It grows out of the feces of bovines for most part. And so from there, we were undoubtedly exposed to the psychedelics. I think very early on, hominins had to develop a very clear set of criteria for differentiating which one of these mushrooms is going to leave you dead tomorrow, which ones are going to be medicines, which ones can be foods, and which ones are going to put you into these extraordinary spaces that you don't know, exactly what's happening, but some very incredible things occur to you in terms of your realization of the nature of the world. And so I think that in the beginning, the use was incidental, which is to say that, from time to time, our hominid ancestors consumed these during the wet seasons, the rainy seasons when they produce and had these experiences, and it had effects upon the group in a variety of ways. I mean, we can infer from, modern clinical studies that this probably had the effect of enhancing group solidarity, probably had the effect of, reducing fear and defensiveness and apprehension. And just looking at it strictly from the point of view of a neurotransmitter, it undoubtedly enhanced our ability to do things like deal with stress. It reduced stress responses, it reduced anxiety, it made us more patient, enhanced our ability to cope, and it also increased our ability to adapt, to learn, to engage in associative learning, to extend our adaptations, and probably to engage in more creative behaviors and extend our tendencies for sociality. So these are the things that just would have happened via the 5-HT2A receptor signaling responses. All of these kinds of simple pharmacological adaptations would have occurred in our behavior and then would have set the stage for eventually incorporating them into ritual, deliberate use, healing, and other kinds of social events.
Yeah, we can definitely see from the more recent studies how profound some of these changes can be in terms of psilocybin's action on human behavior and brain connectivity. So it's no doubt that that would have had impacts, I think, back in the day. And in terms of the biological dynamics, in your paper you describe psychedelics as extraordinary plastogens that stimulate neuroplasticity. So could you explain a little bit more about how these mechanisms might have driven brain evolution? So not only were they having benefits for our ancestors, but how did those benefits actually change the course of our brain evolution? And I would also like to tie this a bit into Terence McKenna, who was an ethnobotanist and influential figure in psychedelic culture and very known for the Stoned Ape hypothesis or Stoned Ape Theory, which basically posits that psychedelics played a pivotal role in the rapid cognitive and cultural evolution of early humans. So what is your opinion on all of this in terms of psychedelics and their role in human evolution?
Well, lots of questions there and lots of mechanisms involved. I mean, I think that, at one level we have to look at the effects of psychedelics just in terms of adaptation. That may or may not have any implications for changing the genome. That is to say, they help us get along better in a lot of different kinds of ways. Now, how would that have, changed the brain? How would this have become a factor in terms of a selective influence upon our brain? Well, one would have been, it may have been the selective influence that led to the increase of the 5-HT2A receptor system in humans compared to chimps. So it just may have been that those of our ancestors that were best capable of utilizing the 5-HT2A receptor system as a means of accommodating the influences from psilocybin were then the ones that got to survive and reproduce. And so that 5-HT2A preference gets passed on. There may have been other kinds of effects that were selective on the human genome. So for instance, one of the things that's interesting is that the limited amount of primate studies that have been done with psychedelics suggest that for the most part, they do not like psychedelics. You put them in a cage and give them levers that give them cocaine or heroin or alcohol or psilocybin. They'll keep pressing the heroin lever and the cocaine lever and the alcohol lever. But once they figure out the one that gives you psychedelics, they go, I don't think I want to try that one again. So that started to suggest that in the human line, there was a selection for those of us that were like, hey, I may try that one again. And so then there was going to be this whole selective influence that, basically might be boiled down to the notion of, who can profit from the ingestion of psilocybin. And so those who had the genetic capabilities and the neural capabilities to benefit from it were the ones that got the benefits from it. And those that couldn't handle it, didn't have the same reproductive advantages, and their genes weren't as likely to be transferred on to the future. But the general notion here is that there's a number of different, mechanisms, both the immediate effects and then some kind of potential genetic influence. And I think eventually we're going to show that there was a profound influence. And I think the data is already out there, and I may have a bunch of it already in a file full of articles that compare the chimp brain with the human brain. And every time I start to look at these articles, when I look at the difference between the human brain and the chimp brain, those differences are specifically in areas that are preferentially targeted by psychedelics. So to me, this would be the conclusive evidence that a selective influence exerted by psilocybin exerted a reproductive advantage for those of our ancestors who could use these. And those who could have those particular genetic propensities were the ones that were most likely in survival and reproduction and sort of concentrated a set of 5-H2, preferential utilization capacities into the human line.
Okay, so there's this evidence of the genetic differences between humans and chimps and how psychedelics could fit into that. So how conclusive is that really? Is it evidence that psychedelics did help humans evolve, or is it evidence that there could be some kind of third factor that's influencing both the human brain and the way that we ingest and experience psychedelics? How strong is that causal relationship, and what research is still needed to uncover it fully?
Well, let me put this in a broader context of what some people have called the drug utilization paradigm. Mm-hmm. Going back 35 years, evolutionary biologists, evolutionary psychologists have pointed out we evolved to use drugs. We have enzymes that are specifically designed to remove the toxic effects of what are otherwise neurotransmitter analogs, complex substances that have these protectors, and that there's also clear evidence that we have developed enzymatic capacity to uptake these, to preferentially uptake. So if you look at what are drugs in the animal plant world, they are deterrents to consumption. Plants produce these substances, alkaloids, to keep animals from eating them. We evolved the capacity to take the dangerous part of the alkaloid off and to make it useful for us because it's a neurotransmitter precursor. So if you look at the literature out there, it seems like anthropologists and evolutionary biologists do not have any trouble at all accepting that we evolved to use alcohol, we evolved to use stimulants, we evolved to use sedatives and depressants, but oh my God, don't bring psychedelics into the picture. And I mean, I could go on stories I've had across my career about people who are gung-ho about the drug instrumentalization paradigm until you mention psychedelics. And oh, no, we're not going to talk about that. To my mind, the evidence that we have for the drug instrumentalization paradigm is far stronger in terms of what's out there for a psychedelic instrumentalization paradigm. The problem is that no one's putting the evidence together. No one's making this chart that on one hand shows all the differential, advantages that the human brain has over the chimp brain, and then makes a list of all the areas of the brain that are differentially stimulated by psychedelics. Eventually I'm going to do this. Hopefully somebody will beat me to it and save me the work. But to me, that would be the definitive evidence. Most of the areas of the human brain that are differentially selected for in comparison to the chimp brain are the same areas of the brain that are stimulated by psychedelics. So what was the environmental influence that led to the selection in the hominid line for brain features that distinguish us from the chimps? Well, if you have something out there that stimulates that part of the brain, that would, to me, be considered relatively conclusive evidence, unless you've got a better hypothesis. So to me, the data's out there. It's just someone to sit down and put it all together and try to get it published too. That's the other problem. I think that, there's just a lot of people out there that, do not want to hear that psychedelics are also part of the drug instrumentalization paradigm and human evolution. So I kind of skipped over McKenna there. I mean, McKenna's perspectives didn't have the advantage of, the last 35 years of psychedelic research. McKenna was, limited to a few studies about perceptual acuity and mostly observations at hippie raves. But, he inferred from the effects upon behavior that there would have been certain selective advantages of groups that used them. As I recall from his work, one of the primary things that he emphasized was just this sense of sociality, collectivity. I think his one particular point was that, males might have become, less concerned about mate guarding and more concerned about, general well-being. And, there's certainly a lot of reason to think that McKenna was right about that in some ways, although that's probably just, the beginning, just the tip of a very complex set of social changes that would have been able to be facilitated by the use of the psychedelics. And so here we enter into the concept of, how did humans evolve? And, what's clear is that the basic way in which humans evolved, apart from our brain capacities, has to do with ultrasociality, which is our ability to get along with lots of other members of our species, and the cultural niche, which is to say, the framework that we use in order to interact with the environment. So humans, abilities to be ultrasocial ultimately have to do with our abilities to learn patterns of behavior from others. And how would have psychedelics contributed to that pattern of learning? Well, here we're left more to an inference from clinical studies, which says we're going to get along better with other people. We're going to be less defensive. We're going to be less fearful. We're going to view people in a more positive light. We're going to be more extroverted. All this social dynamic. And that may be the most important part of the early influences of psychedelics on human cultural evolution. It allowed us to get along together with people. And, if you look at the, evolution of humans, group size is one of the primary determinants of evolutionary success. Why? Because your biggest enemy is another group that's bigger than you. So being able to bring people together and create larger groups is a fundamental protection, not just from, predators, but from the worst, enemy out there, which is another human being. And ultimately, in the course of human evolution, we faced a number of genetic bottlenecks, where basically the reproductive capacity of local groups was compromised by inbreeding. So, chimpanzees have a way of dealing with this. The females leave the groups. Females leave the groups and go find another group. That's how you get genetic diversity in females. But humans don't want to send our daughters off alone or let them wander off by themselves. And so there's got to be this, ritual exchange of women. And basically that's the fundamental basis of the creation of society, where you trust another group enough that you're going to let this woman that you've created and brought to maturity to leave and go somewhere else. In exchange, of course. But so I think the psychedelics may have played a very important role in the kind of acceptance of others, particularly when you keep in mind that a lot of times, the most, difficult conflicts are with the people that you're geographically closest to. So you have to go through this process of the people that killed some members of your group 3 years ago are not going to be the people that take your daughter. And so I think psychedelics may have played a role in these kind of emotional adaptations, openness, forgiveness, moving into a more compassionate space that would have then allowed groups to feel more comfortable about this kind of exchange of the reproductive capacity between them, and then ultimately the integration of groups.
Yeah, and that makes sense in terms of what we see even today in psychedelic studies. I mean, in a previous episode, I chatted with Dr. Ann Wagner, who studies MDMA as a tool to help in couples therapy and sort of relational healing. And other psychedelics, too, have been shown to increase sort of plasticity for social reward learning and this like social cohesiveness, which we'll get into how maybe that could be helpful in terms of global crises that are happening today.
Well, let me just throw in that Anne contributed a paper to this special issue of Frontiers that we did on psychedelic sociality. We have like 25 articles in a special issue back in, I think, 2021, 2022, all examining one way or another how it is that psychedelics help enhance our ability to be sociable, which is our most important tool for adaptation.
I agree. And in terms of stress adaptation or innovative problem solving, how do you think psychedelics impact this, and how can that sort of tie into human survival strategies? And does that sort of correlate with clinical evidence that we're seeing today?
Well, first, I mean, the 5-HT2A dynamic is basically, in contrast to the 5-HT1A, is an adaptive stress response. The 5-HT1A response says you just put up with bad stuff. You manage to find some way just to tolerate it. And the 5-HT2A response is, how can we change this shit? How can we make it better? How can we alter the circumstances? How can we change our responses? So the 5-HT2A response is basically an adaptive stress mechanism that allows us to make associative learning and to change how it is that we deal with problems. Now, that might be seen in and of itself as evidence for enhanced creativity. There's a small number of articles, studies that have been done on psychedelics and creativity. Most of them are I'd say flawed would be one way of looking at it. They're just not sophisticated enough. And it begins with just how do you assess creativity anyway, and how do you take expectancy effects? I mean, if you try to do a creativity test with someone before and after psychedelics, I mean, they're intrinsically motivated to make sure they look more creative afterwards, because they wouldn't be taking psychedelics in the first place if they didn't think that there was that kind of effect. So to me, the clinical evidence for the creativity aspect is not as strong, but there's clearly lots of other kinds of incidental evidence, including just how people come to view their lives in different ways. So, I mean, I think ultimately the creativity dimension will be, borne out, but it may not so much be in the way that we normally think about creativity, but rather in the way in which we put together things in a more harmonious, adaptive, and integrative kind of way, which we might just think of as, okay, well, I figured out how to solve this problem. Not that, I became creative all of a sudden.
Yeah, definitely. And you can see how that would be helpful for humans. I mean, problem solving is something that has allowed us to increase our lifespan, to advance technologies that have saved lives. So definitely an important piece. And in terms of culture and cultural practices as well, you've argued that culture is a pinnacle human adaptation. So how have psychedelics been instrumentalized in cultural practices? And this could also tie into some of the points in your handbook on entheogenic healing. So things like divination or scenario planning and healing rituals. I would love to hear a bit more about that.
Okay, well, when you look at where it is that psychedelics have been incorporated into cultural institutions around the pre-modern world, the evidence we have, I mean, they become the core of spiritual, religious, and healing practices. Where people are not, using them for things that really stray much from those core functions. So then that leads us to the question, what is the significance of spirituality and religion and ritual healing, and in particular shamanic healing, for human adaptation and survival? So in that sense, we have a very substantial amount of evidence about how these are adaptive practices. I mean, if we just take the concept of religion, I mean, in the last 20, 30 years, evolutionary anthropologists have gone from trying to explain religion away as some kind of spandrel or even, malignant, parasite, to recognizing that religion is one of the most powerful forces in creating human society. And religion creates human society through lots of different kinds of effects, from psychological and emotional to social, but ultimately religion is a society building tool. That's what religion is fundamentally about. It's not about God. God just becomes a convenient tool for enhancing the program that was already there for using religion to enhance sociality. Spirituality, I think, is closely tied to there, but certainly can give us a number of other dimensions of adaptation, including just how we view ourselves as beings. And I think the spiritual dimension allows us to expand our sense of the inclusiveness of others within a framework provided by identity with spirits, by internalization of spirits, etc. And then ultimately, the fundamental changes of perspectives. Many people would say that the spirituality is a set of perspectives that take us beyond the narrow ego-focused concerns of our lives. And of course, that's what you need to enhance sociality. You need to look beyond, what's in it for you to what's in it for everybody else here too. So ultimately, the mechanisms of ritual healing may have also been one of the more substantial areas in which psychedelics contributed to human survival and well-being. And, psychedelics are well known for their placebo-enhancing effects. And we have to understand that ritual healing evolved as a set of institutions to facilitate the elicitation of placebo responses and other kinds of endogenous healing responses. That the placebo response is not something to get rid of in terms of understanding medical treatment. The placebo response is basically our endogenous response to adversity in an adaptive way that takes the body out of a highly stressed situation and places it into a better homeostatic mode. So the placebo response deals with the stress response. It deals with anxiety, it deals with fear, it deals with uncertainty, it deals with connection, it deals with the endorphin system, and all these other neurological systems. The placebo response is just a misnomer for understanding how it is that a variety of social and ritual cues elicit the body to enter into a healthier state of well-being. So I think the psychedelics played a particularly important role in the overall evolution of the healing capacity. And of course, once they were incorporated into the healing ritual, there was just this wide range of conditions that could be treated. I remember when I first started, writing about how it is that psychedelics are used in pre-modern societies. It's like, how can they be used for so many different things, Well, it must be some kind of placebo effect. But that misses what's really happening. Psychedelics are transdiagnostic, applicable to a wide range of different conditions, because the psychedelics have the capacity to stimulate neurogenesis and plastogenesis and to rewire the brain and to shift the balance in the serotonergic and dopaminergic nervous systems and do a whole wide variety of different things that in of themselves then have all these diverse downstream mechanisms. So how is it that humans came to use these things in adaptive ways. I think that there may have really been some very simple kinds of, selections for what worked. Even before I did this Handbook of Entheogenic Healing, I had published an article on the evolved psychology of set and setting, which is basically arguing that if you look at shamanic practices, if you look at the pre-modern ritual use of entheogens, they have a very specific way of doing ritual. And that the specific way of doing entheogenic ritual has direct correspondences to a number of features of our evolved psychology. And so what we come to recognize is that the way in which pre-modern cultures use psychedelics, one way or the other came to hone in on how it was to use these substances in a way in which their effects were able to be maximized by the envelope of ritual, of set and setting. And so in this sense, I've proposed a rather radical notion that set and setting should not be arbitrary, cultural, and personal, that set and setting ought to be an adaptation to our evolved psychology of ritual healing that's represented in the pre-modern practices of shamanism. And in this book of, the Handbook of Entheogenic Healing, the first two sections of the book deal with what we can call indigenous traditions, where, there's cultures that still speak their, native languages, like the Huichol and the Mazatec and other groups of Mexico. And then there's a bunch of what we can call mestizo practices, where, as is the case with, for instance, the vegetalista traditions of Peru, there's an interaction between the Spanish dominant mestizo culture and the indigenous traditions that created a blend. But when we just look at those two sets, they have remarkable similarities in how they do ritual. It begins with the notion, you need to emotionally prepare beforehand. The healer needs to make sure that they're in the right emotional state. The ceremony is a collective ceremony. It's not the patient and the healer. It's the patient with their friends and family and maybe even community there with the healer and other family groups. It's a community activity. It's done overnight. It starts, into the late evening and typically runs to the next morning. The entheogen is normally consumed by all the members of the group, the healer as well as the patient and the family members. Things such as, the mimetic suite, chanting, drumming, dancing, are essential parts of the healing ceremony. In fact, in many cultures, they'll say, it's not the ayahuasca that heals, it's the icaros. It's the songs that the ayahuasca brings that have the healing energy. So now we know a lot about music therapy, the effects of drumming, effects of dancing on health and well-being. We start to move into an understanding that these are part of the intrinsic healing technologies. Why? Well, if we look at the evolutionary development of the mimetic suite of chanting and drumming and dancing, well, these were adaptations for enhanced sociality. They stimulate the endorphin system. They stimulate serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine. These are not just, let's just listen to some music. These are tools. These are technologies. And, part of their effects include the stimulation of a variety of endogenous healing responses. So we can talk about the emotional modulation that they provide. Music in and of itself was probably an evolutionary capacity that derived from its ability to modulate emotions. A lot of evolutionary psychologists have tried to discount music as just being the cream on the cake. It's not important. Well, no, the music is important in that, in some people's estimation, music was a fundamental tool for enhancing group size because it provided a tool for creating a kind of grooming experience, the stimulation of other people with good vibes that didn't require you to go over there and pick ticks off everybody else and give them a little massage and calm them down. The song could be broadcast for the whole group. So seeing the role of music in human evolution all of a sudden should, wake us up to let's really pay attention to what the role of music should be in ritual healing and should be in psychedelic healing. One of the things that I think is also pretty clear is that the psychedelics, the entheogens, are used as tools that enhance the ability to understand the nature of the problem. And in many traditions, it's very explicit. It's going to be the patient that comes and tells the healer what it is that they saw as being the root of the problem. This is a revelatory, divinatory experience that's enhanced by the overnight nature of the activity. I don't think it's by chance that rituals are typically done overnight. Why? Well, one of the, I think, most significant reasons is that the overnight nature of the ritual automatically incorporates one of the most important psychological integrative processes of the body. It's called dreaming. And there's a lot of evidence out there of substantial parallels between dreaming and the psychedelic state. I don't think it's just a coincidence. I think that there's a good reason, because they're tapping into some of the same underlying bases in our brain and exploiting what we understand to be a fundamental feature of dreaming, which is the integration of learning, integration of information to provide learning. Of course, we also know it has a variety of other therapeutic effects in terms of, working out through difficult emotions, replaying scenes to understand what happened, creating new scenarios for addressing recurrent problems, etc. But I think one of the reasons why psychedelic therapy in the pre-modern context was done in the overnight setting was that dreams is an important part of doing this. And in many of the entheogenic practices, it's not just a dream during the night, it's what happens in the subsequent nights after the ceremony, where the work continues and you begin to see how you integrate new understandings and perspectives into how you're going to change and live your life. And I think the other part of it is that, the integration periods, we all think, okay, we're going to have a post, ceremony integration after breakfast tomorrow, okay, and then you've done your integration. But, in many cultures, the idea was that, for the next 2 to 4 weeks, things are going to be different. One of the things I miss pointing out in the beginning, one of the recurrent features is that before the ceremony, food restrictions, fasting, sexual abstinence, very important for preparing the person. And then afterwards too, you keep to yourself, limited social contact, careful on what you eat, you don't get involved in relations with other people, you focus on your own energies, you get your own work done, and only, 2, 3, 4 weeks from now are you going to try to make your way back into society once you've consolidated. So the traditional context says, the integration is a prolonged period. The healing doesn't happen in the ceremony. The healing comes from what you do afterwards. It's how you integrate what comes up in the ceremony into a new scenario for life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting to hear you talk about all these different factors, because I think the modern model of psychedelic therapy that is used in psychedelic science does draw from some of those things, like preparation, dosing, integration, but there's so many things that are sort of controlled for or left out or not brought into modern science from these ritualistic practices. So what's your opinion on how much should we incorporate in modern clinical trials?
Well, let me just take the Johns Hopkins model as a good example. I mean, obviously, it's a very successful model. And, it is able to produce outcomes that are far different than what ordinary psychedelic use is. I mean, if you look at mystical experiences and ordinary psychedelic use, they're not that high. The Johns Hopkins model gets 70% of the people having, the kind of experiences that meditators, spend their whole life focusing on to have 1 or 2 opportunities to enter into the mystical state. So they've got a very good model. And, obviously it can have some healing effects too. But to me, it's like it starts at, 8 in the morning and ends at 5 in the evening, when it should be starting at, 8 in the evening and ending at 5 in the morning. They leave out the overnight thing. It's, one patient with 2 therapists sitting there to make sure that neither of them molest the patient, right? I mean, where's the community? Where's the community energy? Where's, the contributions of everybody else in the person's life? I mean, that seems to me to be, what's missing in the modern practice. And then I think the whole community therapy dynamic, I mean, it's more difficult, but I mean, I understand, Ralph Metzner did almost all of his psychedelic work in, group therapy sessions. I don't know that from a direct fact, but this is my understanding of how he did his work. And obviously there can be some very successful models for that. So in a sense, we need to make changes. And I think the changes need to go with the preparation, fasting and sexual abstinence and getting your emotions together and paying attention to dreams beforehand and, coming to the ceremony with a group of people that's going to, engage in music and dancing and song, and it's going to be an overnight performance. You're going to go through the dream cycles. You're going to, use the information, interaction with the healer to try to figure out what the nature of the problem is, and the healer's going to take your dream and your visions and work on them too and come up with. And so there's, to me, a very different kind of approach that's called for here in terms of what we can know about how these things work best, derived from the pre-modern context.
Yeah, and I want to bring it back to the evolution piece because this is a really interesting aspect of it that I think is looking forward, like how this knowledge of psychedelics and human evolution in the past, we can use that to the benefit of society in the future and humanity. So in terms of like the current global challenges, there's a lot of obviously social division, environmental crises. How can psychedelics facilitate harmonious futures, as you mentioned in your article, by sort of enhancing these adaptations to solve some of those global challenges?
Well, I think that the fairest answer is that we will have to see, and then I would say, okay, well, we have some models to work from. One would be that the communal use. Although the initial indication is it's a community of us, it's your people. But we have to move beyond that. It's clear that psychedelics have been used for intercommunity relations. Some evidence about that among the Mazatec, even explicitly using it for resolving intercommunity conflicts. Although in that case, it's a select group of people that come. If we look at some of the examples we have from tribal South America. Clearly it was used psychedelics were used in trying to resolve or minimize intergroup conflict. But it may have been through the controlled expression of conflict and hostility in ritual situations. But clearly you can bring opposing groups together and give them a structure where they can, begin to understand each other's point of view and resolve their differences. I think one possible model would be, bringing together the leaders of different, conflicting groups, and beginning with the leaders. I used to say, we should have, the Palestinians and the Israelis, go to a 2-week ayahuasca retreat, and see whether or not in the context of doing that kind of work, there can be some, movement in perspectives and understanding. That may not, in fact, be possible in this situation, but, the idea would be, you got to change the leadership, as part of this and the interacting with other people. And so, in that sense, it's an intercultural relations dynamic, and there's a lot of information out there in, communication science about intercultural relations and how to create, constructive, positive dynamics for intercultural adaptation and growth. But at this point, we don't have a lot of studies about, how this might work. But I think the idea that, the entheogenic practices of the past tell us the basic model. It's communal. Who constitutes the community may be, sort of sequential. You start off with your own people, and then, you incorporate, people from other groups, and then you put together, more deeply mixed groups, and eventually find ways to create a kind of harmony among members of different groups in a way that then can generate impacts back into their own native groups.
Yeah, such an important area of future investigation. I'm at the last question now, so
Okay.
I want to turn to something that might be more applicable to our listeners and integrating these insights into their everyday life. So what do you think is a key takeaway that you hope the readers or listeners gain about psychedelics' role in healing? Maybe not just for the individual, but for society and our evolutionary trajectory. So what's one thing there, or in general, what's one emerging area of research that you're excited about as well that you'd like to share?
That's a lot of questions for the last question.
You can answer in whatever way you feel.
Well,
right.
I mean, I think that, at one level, I might say, well, this needs to be sort of scaffolded. I don't think that necessarily, a first psychedelic experience ought to be a group, of 20 or 30 or 40 people. Maybe it should be more, particularized, individualized, a few significant others, whatever, and building from that. But the idea is we're building towards using these things as a group. I think that, another important part of it has to be with understanding, the significance of the intention in the set and setting. So these need to be, carefully worked through in a sense that, we need to have some kind of structure, and the traditional practices of entheogenic use focused around healing and focused around community are good guidelines for going forward. I would also say that another important part of this kind of dynamic has to do with how it is that we're going to use these substances to change ourselves. And, when we think about, the traditional view of the entheogens, they were about a personal transformation into a spiritual being, into someone who, in some sense, went through an ego death, went through a transformation, left some sense of who they were behind in order to incorporate, some broader, bigger, more inclusive sense of themselves as a person. And in this way, I think that we should, sort of view the use of psychedelics as a growth towards a psychedelic community. And one of the things that I've found intriguing recently has been the growth of psychedelic Christianity. A year or so back, I edited a sort of an article and commentary about psychedelic Christianity today. What's happening with the Christian churches? It turns out that there's probably 100 Christian churches in the United States today that use psychedelics. Only a couple of them are widely recognized, such as Santo Daime, to a certain extent Union de Vegetal. But to me, this is going to be sort of a game changer for a variety of reasons. If we can bring psychedelics into the space of the mainstream churches. I think it was United Church of Christ was trying to do that recently. I'm thinking, man, if the Unitarian Universalists would take this on, this could be a big game changer in terms of not just how psychedelics become part of the broader society and culture, but also how we can begin to apply psychedelics as healing tools in a context in which they're still criminalized, because religious rights of freedom to religious expression have provided the context within which the expansion of these uses is taking place, and obviously many of these are in some sense intrinsically about healing. So maybe, for Western society and culture, psychedelic Christianity might be one of the most powerful tools in the future for how these substances shape our society and the cultural landscape.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Michael. It was truly a pleasure.
My pleasure, Elena. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me for this fascinating conversation with Dr. Michael Winkelman. As always, I'd like to thank the Center for Psychedelics Health and Research at Queen's University and the support of our sponsors at the Ontario Brain Institute, the Canadian Biomarker Integration Network in Depression, and Providence Care Hospital. Until next time, be well and integrate wisely.